The lightning split the sky like God's own fury, and Gideon Jameson saw her through sheets of rain so thick he could barely make out the shape of his own horse's ears. She was stumbling along the muddy road leading into Helena, Montana, her dress plastered to her frame, arms wrapped around herself as she shook so violently he could see it even from 50 yards away. It was late April in 1878, and spring storms in this territory came down with a vengeance that could freeze a person to death even when snow wasn't falling. Gideon had been riding back to his ranch after 3 days of cattle trading when the storm caught him, and he'd been cursing his decision not to stay another night in town when he spotted her. "Madam!" he shouted over the thunder, urging his horse forward. "Madam, you cannot be out here." She turned toward his voice, and even in the darkness punctuated only by lightning flashes, he saw the terror in her eyes. For a moment he thought she might run from him, which would have been the worst thing she could do, but then her knees buckled and she went down hard in the mud. Gideon was off his horse in seconds, kneeling beside her. "I am not going to hurt you," he said firmly, close to her ear so she could hear him over the storm. "But you will die out here if you do not let me help you. My ranch is a mile from here. Will you let me take you there?" She nodded weakly, her teeth chattering so hard he worried she might bite through her tongue. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she was, and managed to get her onto his horse before swinging up behind her. She slumped against him, and he could feel the cold radiating from her body through his own rain-soaked coat. He wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady and urged his horse into a careful gallop, praying they would make it back before she succumbed to the cold. The ride felt like it took hours, though it could not have been more than 15 minutes. By the time they reached his ranch house, she had stopped shivering, which was a bad sign. Gideon had seen enough men die of exposure to know that when the shivering stopped, you were running out of time. He half carried, half dragged her up the porch steps and through the front door, kicking it shut behind him with his boot heel. The fire in his hearth had died down to embers, but embers were enough. He laid her on the rug in front of the fireplace and immediately set about building up the flames, adding kindling and then larger logs until the fire roared back to life. Only then did he turn his attention back to her. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as death. Her dark hair hung in sodden ropes around her face, and her dress, which might have been blue or gray when dry, was now black with water and mud. Gideon knew what he had to do, even if it was improper. He grabbed every blanket he owned from the chest by the wall and from his bed in the next room, then knelt beside her again. "Madam, I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said clearly, even though her eyes were closed and he was not sure she could hear him. "You will die if I do not. I promise I will be respectful. But I have to do this." Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Gideon worked as quickly and clinically as he could, peeling the wet dress from her body and removing her soaked undergarments. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible, focusing on the task at hand rather than the fact that he had a naked woman in his home. Once she was free of the wet clothing, he wrapped her in the first blanket, then the second, then the third, cocooning her in layers of dry wool. He arranged her as close to the fire as he dared, then went to change out of his own wet clothes before he ended up in the same state she was in. When he returned in dry trousers and a flannel shirt, she was shivering again. He sat down beside her and felt an overwhelming relief at that sign of life returning to her body. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as they landed on his face. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and rough. "My ranch, about a mile outside Helena," Gideon said. He kept his tone calm and even. "I found you on the road. You were nearly dead from the cold." "I remember," she said slowly. "The storm. I was trying to reach town." "Well, you nearly did not make it." He stood and went to the kitchen area, returning with a cup of water. "Drink this slowly. Your body needs to warm up gradually." She struggled to get her arms free of the blankets, and he helped her, holding the cup to her lips so she could sip. Some of the water dribbled down her chin, and she made a frustrated sound. "Easy," he said. "You have been through something terrible. Give yourself time." After she had drunk about half the cup, she leaned back with a sigh. "Thank you," she said. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You would have," Gideon said bluntly. "What were you doing walking alone in a storm like that?" Her face clouded, and he saw fear flicker in her eyes again. They were brown, he noticed now, a deep brown that reminded him of rich soil after rain. "I was running," she said quietly. From what? She hesitated, and he could see her weighing how much to tell him. Finally, she said, "From my employer. He tried to force himself on me." Anger flared hot in Gideon's chest. He kept his voice level. "Who?" "Richard Thornton. He owns the Grand Helena Hotel. I was working as a maid there." Gideon knew Thornton, or at least knew of him. He was a wealthy man who had moved to Montana Territory 2 years ago and built his hotel with money from back east. He had a reputation as a shrewd businessman, but Gideon had never heard anything about him being the sort to assault his employees. Then again, those sorts of things often went unspoken. "You are safe here," Gideon said firmly. "He will not touch you again." "You do not understand," she said, and there was desperation in her voice now. "He has influence. He told me that if I reported him, no one would believe me, that I would be thrown out on the street with nowhere to go." "I believe you," Gideon said simply. "And you are not on the street. You are here, and you are safe." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over and running down her cheeks. Gideon felt awkward in the face of her emotion, but he reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder through the blankets. "What is your name?" he asked. "Winnie," she said, her voice breaking. "Winnie Osborne." "I am Gideon Jameson," he told her, "and you can stay here as long as you need to, at least until the storm passes and you have decided what you want to do." She looked at him with something like wonder. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." "Because it is the right thing to do," Gideon said, "and because no woman should have to run into a storm to escape a man's violence." The storm raged on through the night. Gideon made Winnie drink more water and then some warm broth he heated over the fire. As the hours passed and the warmth seeped back into her body, color returned to her face, and her shivering finally stopped. He gave her one of his shirts to wear under the blankets since her own clothes were still soaked and muddy, and she accepted it with shy gratitude. They talked in fits and starts. Gideon learned that Winnie was 21 years old, originally from Ohio. She had come west after her parents died in a fire 2 years earlier, hoping to make a fresh start. She had been working at the Grand Helena Hotel for 8 months, sending most of her wages to her younger brother who was still back east finishing his schooling. The attack had happened that evening, and she had fled without even grabbing her few possessions, too frightened to stay a moment longer. In turn, Gideon told her about his ranch. He was 26, had been working this land for 4 years after spending his youth working on other men's ranches and saving every penny. He ran cattle mostly with some horses. It was hard work and often lonely, but it was his, and that meant everything. "Do you never get lonely out here by yourself?" Winnie asked. The fire cast dancing shadows across her face, and Gideon found himself thinking that she was beautiful, even with her hair still damp and tangled. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I prefer my own company to the company of most people in town. Present company excluded," he added with a small smile. She returned the smile, tentative but real. "I know what you mean. I always felt like I did not quite fit anywhere, like I was always on the outside looking in." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Gideon said. "People on the outside see things more clearly." "Maybe," Winnie said thoughtfully. Then she yawned, wide and involuntary. "You should sleep," Gideon said, standing. "You can have my bed. I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Winnie protested. "You can and you will," Gideon said firmly. "You have been through something terrible, and you need proper rest. I have slept in worse places than in front of a warm fire, believe me." She looked like she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion won out. He helped her to her feet, keeping the blankets wrapped around her, and guided her to his bedroom. It was a simple room with a single bed, a dresser, and a washstand, but it was clean, and the bed had plenty of quilts. She climbed in gratefully, and he pulled the covers up around her. "Thank you, Gideon," she said softly, her eyes already drifting closed. "I do not know what would have happened to me if you had not come along." "Sleep well, Winnie," he said, and quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. He settled himself in front of the fire, using his saddle as a pillow and wrapping himself in his coat since he had given all the blankets to Winnie. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside, the house was warm and dry. Gideon stared into the flames and thought about the woman sleeping in his bed. He had acted on instinct when he found her, driven by basic decency and the knowledge that no one deserved to die alone in a storm. But now that she was here, safe and recovering, he found himself thinking about things he had not thought about in a long time. Things like companionship and partnership and the sound of another person's voice in his home. He shook his head at himself. She had just escaped an assault. The last thing she needed was another man looking at her with desire. He would help her, keep her safe until she could figure out what to do next, and then she would move on with her life. That was all there was to it. But as he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of her brown eyes and the way she had smiled at him through her exhaustion. The morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. Gideon woke to find the fire burned down to ashes and his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. He stretched carefully, working out the kinks, then set about rebuilding the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He was just slicing bacon when he heard the bedroom door open. Winnie emerged wearing his shirt, which hung to her knees, with the blankets wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. Her hair was still tangled, but her face had color in it again, and she looked stronger than she had the night before. Good morning, she said somewhat shyly. Morning, Gideon replied. How are you feeling? Much better. Sore, but alive. She came to stand near the fire, watching him work. Can I help with anything? You can sit down and rest, Gideon said. You have been through an ordeal. I would rather help, Winnie said. I do not like feeling useless. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then nodded toward the pantry. There are eggs in there. You could scramble some if you like. Her face brightened, and she went to fetch the eggs. They worked in companionable silence, and soon had a simple breakfast of bacon, eggs, and coffee ready. They ate at Gideon's small table, and he found himself watching the way the morning light came through the window and caught in her hair. What will you do now? He asked gently. Winnie's expression grew troubled. I do not know. I cannot go back to the hotel, that is certain, but I do not have much money, and I do not have anywhere else to go. You could stay here, Gideon heard himself say before he had really thought it through. Winnie looked up at him in surprise. Stay here? Just until you figure things out, Gideon said quickly. I have the space and I could use help around the ranch. You could work for room and board and save your wages until you have enough to make a new start somewhere. He could see her considering it, hope and caution warring in her expression. Are you certain? You do not know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible person. I doubt that, Gideon said. And yes, I am certain. I would not have offered if I was not. What about propriety? Winnie asked. If people find out I am living here with you, unmarried, they will talk. Gideon shrugged. Let them talk. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not the sort to take advantage of a woman in need, and anyone who does not know me does not matter. Winnie bit her lip, clearly tempted. I would work hard, she said. I would earn my keep. I know you would, Gideon said. So is it settled? You will stay? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the exact instant she made her decision. Her shoulders straightened and her chin lifted. Yes, she said. Yes, I will stay. Thank you, Gideon. You have no idea what this means to me. You're welcome, he said simply, and meant it. The next few days fell into a rhythm that surprised Gideon with its ease. Winnie proved to be exactly what she had promised, a hard worker who was determined to earn her keep. She took over the cooking and cleaning, which meant Gideon came in from working the cattle to find hot meals waiting and a clean house. More than that, though, she was curious about the ranch work and asked if she could learn. You want to learn to work cattle? Gideon asked, amused. I want to learn everything, Winnie said firmly. I spent my whole life in cities and towns. I want to know how to do things, real things. Besides, what if something happens and you need help? He could not argue with that logic, so he started teaching her. She learned to milk the cow he kept for fresh dairy, to gather eggs from the chickens, to feed and water the horses. She was not afraid of hard work or getting dirty, and she asked intelligent questions. Gideon found himself enjoying her company more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, about a week after she had arrived, Gideon was mending fence when Winnie brought him water and sandwiches. She sat on the fence rail and watched him work for a while in comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? She said eventually. Sure, Gideon said, not looking up from the wire he was twisting. Why do you live out here alone? A man like you, with land and a good home, I would have thought you would have married by now. Gideon paused in his work. I was engaged once, he said after a moment, 5 years ago. Her name was Catherine. We were going to get married in the spring, and then she decided she did not want to be a rancher's wife after all. She went back east and married a banker. I am sorry, Winnie said softly. That must have hurt. It did, Gideon admitted. But looking back, I think we would have made each other miserable. She wanted things I could not give her. A big house in town, parties, fine dresses. That is not who I am. Who are you? Winnie asked. Gideon considered the question. I am someone who likes the simple things. Open sky, honest work, a warm fire at the end of the day. I want a partner, not someone I have to impress, someone who would rather sit on a fence rail and eat sandwiches than go to a fancy party. Winnie smiled. That sounds nice. That sounds real. What about you? Gideon asked, looking at her now. What do you want? I want to matter, Winnie said quietly. I want to build something, to have a place that is mine. I am tired of just surviving, of always being afraid. I want to live. You are brave, Gideon said, running out into that storm, starting over out here. That takes courage. I do not feel brave, Winnie said. Most of the time I feel terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear, Gideon said. It is doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Gideon felt something shift in the air between them. It was like the feeling before a thunderstorm, electric and full of potential. Then Winnie smiled, and the moment passed, but Gideon carried the feeling with him for the rest of the day. That night after supper, they sat by the fire, as had become their habit. Winnie was mending one of his shirts that had torn on a fence post, and Gideon was oiling his saddle. The domesticity of it struck him, how natural it felt to have her there. I got a letter today, Winnie said suddenly. From my brother, Timothy. He graduates next month. That is wonderful, Gideon said. You must be proud. I am, Winnie said, but she sounded worried. But he wants to come out here, to Montana. He wants to try his luck in the mines or ranching. And you are afraid for him, Gideon guessed. He is only 19, Winnie said, and he is smart, book smart, but he does not know how hard life out here can be. I'm afraid he will get hurt, or worse. You cannot protect him forever, Gideon said gently. At some point, you have to let people make their own choices, even if those choices scare you. I know, Winnie said with a sigh, but it is hard. He is all the family I have left. You could write to him, tell him he can come stay here, Gideon offered. If he's going to be out here anyway, better he has a safe place to land while he figures things out. Winnie looked up at him with shining eyes. You would do that? Let a stranger stay here? He is not a stranger, he is your brother, Gideon said. And yes, I would do that. This house has more room than just me, and from the sound of it, he's a good young man. I could use another hand around here anyway. Gideon Jameson, you are the kindest man I have ever met, Winnie said softly. He felt his face heat. I'm just practical, he muttered, but he was pleased. That night as he lay on his bedroll by the fire, Gideon admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny for days. He was falling for Winnie Osborne. It was not just her looks, though he found her beautiful. It was her strength, her determination, the way she laughed at his dry jokes, and the way she threw herself into learning ranch work. It was the feeling of coming home to a lit house and the smell of cooking food. It was the way she made him feel less alone. But he did not know if she felt the same way, and he was afraid to ask. She had been through trauma, and she needed safety and stability, not another man making demands on her. So he kept his feelings to himself and tried to be content with her friendship. 2 weeks later, Gideon had to make a trip into Helena for supplies. Winnie had been staying on the ranch since the night he found her, and she had not been back to town. He asked if she wanted to come with him, but she shook her head. I am not ready to see people yet, she said, and I definitely do not want to risk running into Thornton. I understand, Gideon said. I will not be long. Just need to pick up some things at the general store. Helena was bustling when he arrived, as it always was. The town had grown considerably in the past few years, with new buildings going up and more people arriving every day, hoping to strike it rich in the gold fields or make their fortune in other ways. Gideon tied his horse outside Larson's general store and went inside. He was examining bags of flour when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Jameson, good to see you in town. Gideon turned to see Marshal Tom Brady, a big man with a handlebar mustache and a no-nonsense attitude. They were friendly, having worked together a few times when cattle thieves had been operating in the area. "Marshal," Gideon said, shaking his hand. "How are things?" "Busy," Brady said. "Always something happening in this town. Say, I wanted to ask you something. You know anything about a missing girl from the Grand Helena Hotel?" Gideon kept his expression neutral. "Missing girl?" "Yeah, one of the maids. Disappeared about 2 weeks ago during that big storm. Her employer, Richard Thornton, filed a report, said she ran off with some of his valuables." Anger surged through Gideon, hot and immediate. "Did he now?" "You do know something," Brady said, his eyes sharpening. Gideon made a quick decision. I found her that night, out on the road in the storm. She nearly died of exposure. She's been staying at my ranch, recovering." "I see," Brady said carefully. "And did she happen to have any stolen valuables on her?" "The only thing she had on her was a soaked dress and shoes," Gideon said flatly. "She ran because Thornton tried to force himself on her. She is not a thief, Marshal. She is a victim." Brady's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation." "It is a serious crime," Gideon shot back, "and it is the truth. If Thornton is saying she stole from him, it is because he is trying to discredit her in case she reports what he did." Brady was silent for a long moment, studying Gideon's face. "I believe you," he said finally. "Thornton has always struck me as slick, too smooth, you know? The kind of man who smiles while he cheats you. But without the girl willing to make a formal complaint, there is not much I can do." "I will talk to her." "Phew," Gideon said. "See if she is willing to make a statement." "You do that," Brady said. "And Jameson, you are a good man for helping her. Not many would." Gideon just nodded and finished his shopping, his mind churning. He had known there might be trouble, but he had hoped Thornton would simply let Winnie disappear. The fact that the man had reported her as a thief meant he was trying to cover his tracks, and that made him dangerous. When Gideon got back to the ranch, Winnie was hanging laundry on the line he had strung between 2 posts. She waved when she saw him, but her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What happened?" she asked, coming to help him unload the supplies. Gideon told her about his conversation with Marshal Brady. As he spoke, he saw the color drain from Winnie's face, and fear returned to her eyes. He is telling people I am a thief," she whispered. "He's going to ruin me." "Not if you tell your side of the story," Gideon said firmly. "The marshal believes you, Winnie. If you make a formal complaint, Thornton will be the one in trouble, not you." "You do not understand," Winnie said, her voice rising. "Men like Thornton always win. He has money and influence. I'm just a maid with no family and no connections. Who is going to believe me over him?" "I believe you," Gideon said, stepping closer. "Marshal Brady believes you, and we are not going to let him get away with this." "He will destroy me," Winnie said, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. "He will make sure I can never work anywhere, never have a decent life." "Then you stay here," Gideon said. "You stay here with me, and you do not have to worry about working for anyone else ever again." Winnie looked up at him, tears streaking her face. "For how long? How long can I hide here before people start asking questions?" "For as long as you want," Gideon said. Then, before he could stop himself, he added, "Forever, if you want." The words hung in the air between them. Winnie stared at him, her eyes wide. "Gideon, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you," Gideon said, his heart pounding. "I know it has only been a few weeks, but these have been the best weeks I have had in years. You make this place feel like a home instead of just a house. You make me happy, Winnie. And if you want to stay, not as an employee, but as my partner, as my wife, I would be honored." "You want to marry me?" Winnie breathed. "I want you to be happy," Gideon said. "If that means marrying me, then yes, I want to marry you. If it means helping you start a new life somewhere else, I will do that too. Whatever you need, Winnie, whatever you want." Winnie was crying harder now, but she was also smiling. "You really mean that?" "Every word," Gideon said. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. "I care about you too," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I was afraid to say it because I thought you were just being kind, that you did not feel the same way." "I feel the same way," Gideon said softly, stroking her hair. "I think I started falling for you that first night, when you were so determined to help with breakfast, even though you had nearly died. Winnie pulled back enough to look up at him. I need to do something about Thornton, she said. I cannot just hide forever. He hurt me, and if I do not speak up, he will hurt someone else. Are you sure? Gideon asked. It will not be easy. I am sure, Winnie said, and he saw the strength in her eyes that he had admired from the beginning. You were right about courage. It is doing what needs to be done even when you are afraid, and I am so afraid, Gideon. But I am also angry. He does not get to ruin my life because he is wealthy and powerful. Then we go to town tomorrow, Gideon said, together, and you tell Marshal Brady everything. That night they sat up late by the fire, talking about the future. Winnie told him about her fears, about the nightmares she still had sometimes of that evening in the hotel. Gideon held her hand and listened, letting her speak without interruption. When she was done, he told her about his own fears, about failing at ranching, about ending up alone and bitter. You will never be alone, Winnie said softly. Not as long as I'm here. Then I will never be alone, Gideon said, and kissed her for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet. When they pulled apart, Winnie was smiling through tears again. I think I started falling for you that first morning, she said, when you were so matter-of-fact about giving me a place to stay, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was the most natural thing in the world, Gideon said. You needed help and I could give it, simple as that. Nothing about you is simple, Gideon Jameson, Winnie said, laughing softly. You are the most complex, wonderful, stubborn, kind man I have ever met. I will take that as a compliment, Gideon said, grinning. They rode into Helena the next morning, both of them tense but determined. Gideon kept Winnie close as they made their way to the marshal's office, watching for any sign of Thornton. The town was busy as always, people going about their business, and no one paid them much attention. Marshal Brady was at his desk when they arrived. He looked up and nodded when he saw them. Miss Osborne, I presume. Yes, sir, Winnie said, her voice steady despite the way her hand trembled in Gideon's. I understand you have something to tell me about Richard Thornton, Brady said, gesturing for them to sit. Winnie sat, but Gideon could feel the tension radiating from her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She told the marshal everything, from the smaller incidents of Thornton making inappropriate comments and finding excuses to touch her, to the night he had cornered her in a storage room and attacked her. Her voice shook, but she kept going, and Gideon felt a fierce pride in her courage. When she finished, Brady was silent for a long moment. Then he said, That took a lot of bravery, Miss Osborne, and I want you to know that I believe you. But, Winnie said, because she clearly heard it in his tone. But the law is complicated, Brady said with obvious frustration. It is your word against his, and he has already established a narrative that you are a thief. Without physical evidence or other witnesses, it will be very difficult to make charges stick. So he just gets away with it, Winnie said bitterly. I did not say that, Brady said. I said it would be difficult, not impossible. Let me do some investigating. Talk to other employees at the hotel. See if anyone else has had similar experiences. Build a case. It will take time, but if we do it right, we can make sure he faces consequences. And in the meantime, Gideon asked. In the meantime, Miss Osborne should stay away from Thornton and his property, Brady said, which it sounds like she's been doing. As for the theft accusation, I will tell him I investigated and found no evidence of stolen goods. That should at least clear her name on that front. It was not everything Winnie had hoped for, but it was something. They left the marshal's office feeling drained but also relieved. As they walked back toward where they had tied the horses, a voice called out behind them, Well, well, if it is not my little runaway maid. They turned to see Richard Thornton standing on the boardwalk. He was a handsome man in his 40s, well-dressed and perfectly groomed. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Gideon stepped slightly in front of Winnie. Keep walking, Thornton. I was just saying hello to my former employee, Thornton said, his voice mild. The one who stole from me and disappeared into the night. The marshal has already investigated that claim and found no evidence, Gideon said flatly. Which you know, because you made it up. Thornton's smile widened. And who are you? Her protector? How noble. Tell me, are you paying her for her services, or is she giving them away for free now? Gideon saw red. His fist connected with Thornton's jaw before he had consciously decided to throw the punch. Thornton went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. Gideon stood over him, his hands clenched into fists. "You will not talk about her that way," Gideon said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will not talk about her at all. If I hear that you have said one word against her reputation, if I hear that you have come anywhere near her, I will make you regret it. Are we clear?" Thornton looked up at him with fury in his eyes, but also with calculation. He was smart enough to know when he was outmatched. "Perfectly clear," he said coldly. Gideon turned and took Winnie's arm, guiding her away. Behind them, he heard Thornton getting to his feet and calling after them. "This is not over, Jameson. You just made a powerful enemy." "I can live with that," Gideon called back without turning around. They were both shaking by the time they reached the horses. Winnie turned to Gideon, her eyes blazing. "You hit him." "I should not have," Gideon said. "I should have kept my temper. But the way he talked about you, I just—" "Thank you," Winnie said softly. "No one has ever stood up for me like that before." "I will always stand up for you," Gideon said. "Always." They rode back to the ranch in silence, both processing what had happened. When they arrived, Winnie went to change out of her town clothes while Gideon tended to the horses. He was brushing down his gelding when she found him in the barn. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" Gideon asked, not looking up from his work. "About your proposal," Winnie said. "About marrying you." Gideon's hands stilled on the brush. "And?" "And yes," Winnie said. "Yes, I want to marry you, Gideon Jameson. I want to build a life with you here. I want to be your partner and your wife." Gideon turned to look at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Winnie said, coming to stand in front of him. "I love you. I think I have loved you since that first night when you saved my life and then gave me your bed and all your blankets. You are a good man, the best man I have ever known, and I want to spend my life with you." "I love you too," Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I knew I could love anyone." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deeper and more passionately than their first kiss. She melted against him, her hands tangling in his hair, and for a long moment the rest of the world ceased to exist. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Winnie laughed. "So when should we get married?" "As soon as possible," Gideon said. "Tomorrow, if we can." "Let's give it a week," Winnie said, smiling. "I want to make a proper dress, and you should probably ask the minister." "A week then," Gideon agreed. "Though I warn you, it will be the longest week of my life." It was both the longest and the shortest week Gideon had ever experienced. During the days, they worked together on the ranch, falling into an easy partnership. Winnie continued to learn, and Gideon was impressed by how quickly she picked things up. She was a natural with the horses, and even the cattle seemed to respond to her calm presence. In the evenings, they planned their future together. Winnie wanted to start a garden, maybe raise some chickens for eggs to sell in town. Gideon talked about expanding the herd, maybe breeding horses as well as cattle. They discussed children, both agreeing they wanted a family, though not right away. First, they wanted time to build their life together, to really know each other as husband and wife. Marshal Brady sent word that he was making progress on his investigation of Thornton. Several other women had come forward with similar stories, and the marshal was building a case. It would take time, but it looked like Thornton would face consequences for his actions after all. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. It was early May, and the Montana landscape was coming alive with spring flowers. Winnie had made herself a simple but lovely dress from fabric Gideon had bought her in town, pale blue cotton with white trim. She had also made him a new shirt, dark green and finely sewn. They were married at the little church in Helena, with Marshal Brady and his wife as witnesses. The minister was a kind older man who had been delighted to perform the ceremony. There were no crowds, no fancy reception, just two people pledging their lives to each other in front of God and a handful of witnesses. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Gideon he could kiss his bride, Gideon felt like his heart might burst with happiness. Winnie looked up at him with so much love in her eyes that he felt humbled by it. He kissed her softly, reverently, and silently promised to spend every day of the rest of his life making her happy. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. When they arrived, Gideon carried Winnie over the threshold, both of them laughing at the old tradition. He set her down gently in front of the fire, which he had banked before they left so it would still be going when they returned. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband," Winnie replied, smiling up at him. That night they came together for the first time, and it was everything they had both hoped for. Gideon was gentle and patient, mindful of Winnie's past trauma, and she responded to him with trust and growing passion. Afterward, they lay tangled together in his bed, their bed now, and talked quietly until they drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Gideon woke to find Winnie already up and making breakfast. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, kissing her neck. "You did not have to get up so early," he murmured. "I wanted to," Winnie said, leaning back against him. "I wanted to start our first full day as husband and wife properly." "I can think of other ways to start the day," Gideon said, and Winnie laughed, swatting him playfully. "Later," she promised, "after breakfast and chores." They fell into married life with surprising ease. Gideon had worried that they might struggle with adjustments, but instead, it felt like they had been married for years. They worked together, ate together, talked and laughed together. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts, and by midsummer they had saved enough to buy more cattle and start expanding the herd. In July, Winnie's brother Timothy arrived. He was a lanky young man with Winnie's same brown eyes and a shy smile. Gideon liked him immediately and put him to work learning the ranch. Timothy took to it with enthusiasm, asking endless questions and working from dawn until dusk. He slept in the barn loft, which they had fixed up into a simple but comfortable room, and joined them for meals. One evening after Timothy had been there for 2 weeks, he said, "I want to thank you both. I know I am imposing on your newlywed time." "You are not imposing," Winnie said firmly. "You are family, and you are welcome here for as long as you want to stay." "She is right," Gideon agreed. "Having your help has been invaluable, Timothy. The ranch is growing faster than I could have managed on my own." "I love it here," Timothy admitted. "I thought I wanted to try the mines, but this feels right. Working the land, taking care of animals, it feels meaningful." "It is meaningful," Gideon said. "And if you want to stay permanently, we can work out a partnership arrangement. This ranch could support all of us, and having another person committed to making it succeed would help tremendously." Timothy's face lit up. "Really? You would do that?" "We are family now," Gideon said simply. "Family takes care of each other." In August, Marshal Brady came to visit with good news. Thornton had been arrested and charged with assault against multiple women, with several victims willing to testify and evidence that he had tried to pay them off to keep quiet. The case against him was strong. He would likely face significant jail time. "Thank you for believing me," Winnie told the marshal. "Thank you for not giving up." "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up," Brady replied. "You started something important, Mrs. Jameson. Because you came forward, other women found the courage to do the same. You should be proud." After the marshal left, Winnie turned to Gideon with tears in her eyes. "It is really over. He's going to pay for what he did." "It is really over," Gideon confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "You are safe, and he can never hurt you or anyone else again." That fall was one of the most productive of Gideon's life. The cattle were thriving, the horses were bringing in good money, and Winnie's garden had produced more vegetables than they could eat themselves, so they had been selling the excess in town. Timothy had proved to be an excellent hand, strong and reliable, and Gideon had officially made him a partner in the ranch. The three of them worked together seamlessly, and the ranch prospered. In November, Winnie realized she was pregnant. She told Gideon one evening as they were getting ready for bed, her voice soft and a little nervous. "Are you happy?" she asked after she had told him. "Happy?" Gideon repeated, then laughed and swept her into his arms, spinning her around. "Winnie, I'm overjoyed. Terrified, but overjoyed." "Me too," Winnie said, laughing with him. "I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong, but also about everything that could go right." "It will go right," Gideon said firmly. "We will make sure of it." The winter was long and cold, as Montana winters always were, but the house was warm and full of life. Timothy had started courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the blacksmith, and he brought her to dinner sometimes. Her name was Sarah, and she was sweet and practical, and Winnie liked her immediately. As Winnie's belly grew, Gideon found himself becoming more protective. He tried not to hover, but he could not help wanting to make sure she was safe and comfortable. Winnie tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. "I am not made of glass," she told him one evening when he had insisted on carrying a basket of laundry for her. "I am perfectly capable of doing my normal chores." "I know," Gideon said, "but let me help anyway. It makes me feel useful." Winnie smiled and kissed him. "You are always useful. But if it makes you feel better, you can carry the basket." In April, as the snow was finally melting and the first green shoots were appearing, Winnie went into labor. Gideon sent Timothy racing to town for the midwife, then stayed with Winnie, holding her hand and trying not to panic. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Gideon was genuinely frightened, but Winnie was strong. She had always been strong. Finally, as dawn was breaking, their son was born. He came into the world wailing, healthy and perfect. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Winnie's arms, and Gideon looked down at his wife and child and felt his eyes fill with tears. "He is beautiful," Winnie whispered, exhausted but radiant. "He looks like you." "He is perfect," Gideon said. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Winnie." "I love you too," Winnie said, then looked down at their son. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite decided. Now, looking at the tiny face of his son, Gideon said, "What about Thomas, after your father?" Winnie's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Jameson. I love it. Papa would have been so proud." Little Thomas was a good baby, sleeping well and eating hungrily. He grew quickly, and Gideon was amazed by how much love he felt for this tiny person. He had thought he understood love when he married Winnie, but fatherhood opened up whole new depths of feeling. That summer was busy. The ranch continued to prosper, and they hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Timothy announced his engagement to Sarah, and they planned a wedding for the fall. Winnie recovered quickly from childbirth and was soon back to working in her garden and helping around the ranch, though Gideon and Timothy insisted she not overdo it. On a warm evening in July, Gideon and Winnie sat on the porch watching the sunset, while Thomas slept in Winnie's arms. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and in the distance they could hear the cattle lowing softly. "Do you ever think about that night?" Winnie asked quietly. "The night you found me in the storm?" "Sometimes," Gideon said. "I think about how easily I could have missed you. If I had taken a different road, or if the lightning had not flashed at just the right moment, we might never have met." "But we did meet," Winnie said, smiling at him. "You saved my life, Gideon, in more ways than one. Before you, I was just surviving, just getting through each day. Now I'm living. I have a home, a family, a purpose. I have love. I have all those things too," Gideon said softly. "Before you, this was just a ranch, land and animals and work. You made it a home. You made me complete." "We complete each other," Winnie said. "That is what makes us work." Gideon leaned over and kissed her gently, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby. "I would ride through 1,000 storms if it meant finding you again," he said. "Let's hope you do not have to," Winnie said, laughing. "Once was quite enough excitement for both of us." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Gideon thought about the journey that had brought them here. A storm, a desperate woman, a moment of compassion that had changed both their lives. He thought about how fragile life was, how quickly things could change, and how important it was to hold tight to the people you loved. In September, Timothy and Sarah were married in the same little church where Gideon and Winnie had said their vows. It was a larger celebration than Gideon and Winnie's had been, with more guests and a proper reception afterward. Winnie helped Sarah make her dress, and Gideon stood as Timothy's best man. It felt right, watching the young couple make their promises to each other, knowing they would be building their life nearby. Timothy and Sarah moved into a small house on the ranch that Gideon and Timothy had built together over the summer. It was simple but sturdy, with a bedroom, a main room, and a good fireplace. Sarah was delighted with it and immediately set about making it a home. With 4 adults working the ranch, they were able to accomplish even more. They built a larger barn, expanded the cattle herd, and started breeding horses in earnest. The ranch was becoming well known in the area for quality livestock, and buyers came from as far away as Wyoming to purchase from them. Thomas grew and thrived. He was a happy child, curious about everything, and he loved the animals. By the time he was 2, he was toddling around the ranch, followed closely by Gideon or Winnie to make sure he did not get into too much trouble. He had Gideon's dark hair and Winnie's brown eyes, and he had both their stubborn determination. When Thomas was 3, Winnie gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Grace. She was smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, with blonde hair that surprised them both, until Winnie remembered her mother had been blonde. Grace was a calm baby who rarely cried, and she seemed content to watch the world with wide, wondering eyes. Timothy and Sarah had their first child the same year, a son they named William. The cousins grew up together, running wild around the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk properly. It was a good life, full of hard work and laughter and love. As the years passed, Gideon sometimes thought about where they might have been if that storm had never happened, if he had not found Winnie shaking and soaked on the road. He would be alone still, working his ranch and going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Winnie would be he did not like to think about where Winnie might be. Dead in the storm, or worse, still trapped in Thornton's employment. But the storm had happened, and he had found her, and they had built this life together. It was not always easy. There were hard years when the cattle market crashed, when disease swept through the herd, when drought killed the crops. There were personal struggles too, arguments and misunderstandings and moments of frustration, but they faced everything together as partners, and they always came through stronger on the other side. By 1890, Gideon was 42 and Winnie was 33. They had 4 children now, Thomas, Grace, and then twins Daniel and Dorothy, born when Winnie was 31. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful in the region, employing several hands and producing both cattle and horses. Timothy and Sarah had 3 children and were running their own portion of the ranch with great success. Helena had changed too, growing from a rough frontier town into a proper city. Montana had become a state the previous year, and there was talk of Helena becoming the capital. The wildness of the West was fading, replaced by law and order and civilization. Gideon was not sure how he felt about that. He missed some aspects of the old days, but he also appreciated the stability and safety that came with progress. One evening in late spring, Gideon and Winnie took a rare moment for themselves, riding out to a high meadow on the ranch where wildflowers bloomed in carpets of color. They dismounted and sat in the grass, watching the sunset paint the sky. "Can you believe it has been 12 years?" Winnie asked, leaning against Gideon's shoulder. 12 years since the storm," Gideon said. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." "We have built a good life," Winnie said. "Better than I ever imagined possible when I was running through that storm, convinced I was going to die." "You built a good life," Gideon corrected. "You took the chance I offered and made something amazing with it. I just provided the place." "You provided so much more than that," Winnie said, turning to look at him. "You provided safety and love and belief in me. You made me feel worthy of good things. That was everything, Gideon." He kissed her, soft and sweet, and marveled that even after 12 years, the touch of her lips could still make his heart race. "You were always worthy of good things," he said. "I'm just glad I got to be the one to give them to you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch, cattle moving, horses whinnying, the faint voices of their children playing. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life well lived. "What do you think the next 12 years will bring?" Winnie asked. "More of the same, I hope," Gideon said. "More children growing up, more cattle and horses, more sunsets like this with you. Maybe some grandchildren eventually." Winnie laughed. "Thomas is only 15. Let's give him a few more years before we start demanding grandchildren." "Fair enough," Gideon said, grinning. "But when the time comes, I'm going to be the sort of grandfather who spoils them rotten." "I have no doubt about that," Winnie said. "You already spoil our children." "They deserve to be spoiled," Gideon said. "They are good kids. We raised them well." "We did," Winnie agreed softly. "We really did." As they rode back to the ranch house as full darkness fell, Gideon thought about all the decisions, big and small, that had led to this moment. If he had turned back during the storm instead of pressing on, if Winnie had not had the courage to accept his help, if they had not fallen in love, or if they had not worked so hard to build something lasting. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and their lives would have been entirely changed. But they had made the choices they made, and those choices had led them here. To this life, to this family, to this deep and abiding love that had sustained them through everything. Gideon was not a particularly religious man, but he believed in fate, and he believed that he and Winnie were meant to find each other that stormy night. The years continued to pass in a steady rhythm. Thomas grew into a strong young man, serious and hard-working like his father. He started courting a girl from town, the schoolteacher's daughter, and talked about getting married when he turned 20. Grace was artistic, always drawing or painting, and she had a gentle way with the horses that reminded Gideon of Winnie. The twins were whirlwinds of energy, constantly getting into mischief but also fiercely loyal to each other and to the family. When Gideon was 50, the family gathered to celebrate his birthday. It was a warm summer evening, and they had a party on the ranch with all their friends and neighbors. There was music and dancing, food and drink, and laughter that rang out across the land. At one point, Gideon stood on the porch and looked out at the crowd, at all these people who had become part of their lives, and felt overwhelming gratitude. Winnie came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. She was 43 now, with silver threads in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes, and Gideon thought she was more beautiful than ever. "Happy birthday," she said softly. "Best birthday I've ever had," Gideon replied, "though you say that every year." "Because it is true every year," Gideon said. "Every year with you is the best year." "Flatterer," Winnie said, but she was smiling. "It is not flattery if it is true," Gideon pointed out. He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you, Winnie Jameson. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Winnie said, "always and forever." They stood there together, watching their children dance and their friends celebrate, and Gideon thought about that terrified young woman he had found soaking wet and shaking in the storm all those years ago. She had been running from danger, from a man who wanted to hurt her, with nowhere to go and no one to help her. And now here she was, surrounded by family and friends, secure and loved and happy. He thought about himself too, the lonely cowboy working his ranch alone, convinced that his chance at happiness had passed him by. He had been going through the motions of living, working hard, but not really feeling connected to anything. And then the storm had brought them together, and everything had changed. Sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it came in the form of a storm that forced you off the road you had been traveling. Sometimes it came wrapped in blankets by a fire, two people finding warmth and safety and eventually love in each other. Gideon did not know what the future would bring. More years, hopefully many more years, with Winnie by his side. Grandchildren, almost certainly, and the joy of watching the next generation grow. Changes, because change was inevitable, but he hoped that the essential things would remain the same: the ranch, the family, the love. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Gideon and Winnie said their goodbyes, and then walked hand in hand to the meadow where they had sat so many times over the years. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light across the landscape. They sat in the grass, and Winnie leaned against Gideon's shoulder just as she had that evening 12 years ago, and 20 years ago, and every time in between. "Thank you," Winnie said quietly. "For what?" Gideon asked. "For finding me," Winnie said. "For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this life." "Thank you for letting me find you," Gideon replied, "for trusting me, for loving me back, for making my life worth living." They sat in the moonlight, two people who had found each other in a storm and built something beautiful together. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. And whatever those tomorrows brought, Gideon knew they would face them together as they had faced everything else, with courage, with determination, and with love. The ranch continued to thrive as the new century approached. By 1895, Thomas had married his sweetheart, Mary, and they were expecting their first child. Grace, at 18, had her work displayed in several shops in Helena and was making a name for herself as an artist. The twins were 15 and already talking about what they wanted to do with their lives. Daniel was interested in medicine and wanted to go to school back east, while Dorothy loved the ranch and wanted to stay and work the land like her father. Timothy and Sarah's children were also grown, or nearly so, and the ranch had expanded to include several houses and outbuildings. It was a small community unto itself, bound together by blood and affection and shared purpose. Gideon looked around at what they had built and felt proud. This was legacy. This was what mattered. When Thomas and Mary's son was born in early 1896, they named him Gideon after his grandfather. Gideon Sr. held his tiny namesake and felt his eyes sting with tears. He thought about his own father, who had died when Gideon was young, and how much he wished the old man could have seen all of this. But maybe he could somehow. Maybe he was watching and was proud. "He has your nose," Winnie said, looking over Gideon's shoulder at the baby. "Poor kid," Gideon said, but he was smiling. "I think it is a very distinguished nose," Winnie said. "Both of you." As Gideon looked down at his grandson, he thought about the cycles of life, how everything came around again. This baby would grow up on this ranch, learning the same lessons Gideon had taught his children. He would know the value of hard work, the importance of family, the beauty of the land, and maybe someday he would tell his own children about his great-grandmother, the brave woman who had run into a storm and changed everything. The years rolled on, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. There were more grandchildren, 9 in total by the time Gideon was 60. There were losses, too. Sarah's father died, and then Gideon's old friend Marshall Brady. They attended funerals and celebrated weddings, saw children born and loved ones laid to rest. It was the rhythm of life, beautiful and terrible and precious. Through it all, Gideon and Winnie remained each other's constant. They still rode out to their meadow on clear evenings, still sat by the fire and talked late into the night. Their love had deepened and matured over the years, becoming something both comfortable and profound. They could communicate with a look, finish each other's sentences, sense when the other was troubled or happy, or needed comfort. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1908, the family threw a huge celebration. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with Timothy and Sarah and their extended family, and what felt like half the town of Helena. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and a cake so large it took 3 people to carry it. When Gideon was asked to say a few words, he stood with Winnie beside him and looked out at all the faces watching them. 30 years ago, he said, I found this woman soaking wet and shaking in a storm. She was running from danger, scared and alone. I wrapped her in blankets by the fire and thought I was just doing the right thing, the decent thing. I had no idea that I was really saving myself. He turned to look at Winnie, whose eyes were shining with tears. You saved me, Winnie. You took this lonely cowboy and his empty house and filled it with love and laughter and life. You gave me children and grandchildren. You built this ranch with me. You stood by me through good times and bad. You are my partner, my best friend, my love. These 30 years have been the greatest gift of my life, and I thank God every day that He sent that storm to bring us together. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Gideon leaned down and kissed his wife. The applause was deafening, but he barely heard it. All he heard was Winnie whispering against his lips, I love you, forever and always. As they danced together under the stars, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, Gideon thought about the choices that had led them here. He could have ridden past that night, focused on getting home and out of the storm. Winnie could have run from him, too frightened to trust. They could have parted ways after she recovered, going back to their separate lives. But instead, they had chosen each other, again and again, every day for 30 years. That was what love was, Gideon realized. Not just the big dramatic moments, the rescue in the storm, or the proposal, or the wedding. It was all the small choices in between, choosing to be kind when you were tired, choosing to listen when you wanted to be heard, choosing to stay when it would have been easier to leave, choosing every single day to build something together. The party went late into the night, and when it was finally over and the last guests had departed, Gideon and Winnie walked back to their house hand in hand. They stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the ranch, at the life they had made. No regrets? Gideon asked softly. Not a single one, Winnie replied. You? None, Gideon said. Except maybe that I did not find you sooner. Winnie laughed. We found each other at exactly the right time. not a moment too soon or too late. They went inside together, into the warmth and light of their home. The fire was banked but still glowing, just as it had been that first night so many years ago. Gideon wrapped his arms around Winnie, and she leaned against him with a contented sigh. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. A storm was coming, but they were safe inside, wrapped in each other's warmth, just as they had been 30 years before. And as the first drops began to fall, Gideon sent up a silent prayer of thanks for storms, for second chances, and for the woman who had changed his life forever.